Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session on professional development for executives, how to create a powerful personal brand. Can we go on to the next slide, please? So my name is Lucky Singh, and I'm the Client Relationship Manager here at King's Business School. And I oversee the recruitment and admission side of things for our executive education programs, which includes the Executive MBA program, our mini MBA for in-house lawyers, and our strategic marketing MSc programs. Joining me today is my fantastic colleague, Gillian Brooks, who is a lecturer in strategic marketing, and she teaches across a lot of our executive education programs, including our executive MBA. So I'll be handing over to her shortly to take you through the session. But if you could go on to the next slide, I'll just take you through the agenda. So in today's session, Gillian will be taking you through how to develop a powerful personal brand and how to develop your executive presence. We'll then be launching into a Q&A session. So any questions, please pop them into the Q&A box and we'll be answering those very shortly. Alternatively, you can put them in the chat as well. So that's all fine. And if you'd like to have a conversation, you can unmute yourself and we can do that during the Q&A as well. So we want this to be as interactive as possible. And then after the Q&A, I'll tell you a little bit more about our Executive MBA program very shortly, and then talk to you about sort of next steps and some exciting things that we've got coming up as well. But thank you so much for joining, and I'm going to hand over now to Gillian to start the session.
Great. Thank you so much, Lucky, and welcome to our session. I'm really glad there's so many people joining, and I look forward to hearing from you during the Q&A if you have any questions. So before we get started, I'm just going to give you a little bit of a background on myself and some of the sort of interdisciplinary lenses that I apply to my research as well as my teaching. So I'm a lecturer of strategic marketing here at King's, and my research really looks at influencer marketing, social media strategy, branding, and communications. So really anything in sort of the digital marketing space is what I cover in both my research and my teachings. So I joined King's in August 2020, which is obviously a unique time to join a business school. Prior to that, I was a postdoc in marketing at the Saïd Business School at the University of Oxford for 3 years, really trying to bridge this gap between my PhD, which was in sociology, and working in a business school. So I realized that if I wanted to understand consumers, it was important to obviously understand people, bringing, of course, that sociological lens to light. Prior to that, I was a teaching fellow in media and communications at the London School of Economics, as well as an adjunct professor at Georgetown University for a course that I developed called The Business of Branding. My PhD, as I mentioned, is in sociology from the University of Cambridge, where I looked at how online news organizations gain legitimacy in the field of journalism. So this was an ethnographic study looking at the Huffington Post, the Drudge Report, and Breitbart.com, and how those organizations sort of changed quite fundamentally the journalism landscape in the United States, as well as changing notions of legitimacy overall. I have a Master of Arts, in Communication and Technology from Georgetown University, where I lived in Washington, D.C. For 2 years. It was an exceptional time. I was able to get involved with Obama's campaign in 2007, leading to his victory in 2008, registering voters, doing grassroots campaigning, and really understanding the political landscape of this very unique district in the United States. Prior to that, I did my undergraduate in communications and comparative literature at McMaster University in Canada. And I also worked in industry as a publicist at a global media relations firm in Toronto. So I am originally from Canada, but having lived in both the US and the UK, I really am bringing not only an interdisciplinary, but an international lens to both my teaching and my research. So for today, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at personal branding, which is often a term or a concept that people tend to roll their eyes at. They're a bit stigmatized, feel quite stigmatized in discussing it because it does sound quite vain. But today, specifically post-COVID, it's extremely important that everyone, regardless of your level of seniority within a company, is thinking about their personal brand. And that's because your personal brand is genuinely what other people say about you when you leave a room, right? For better or for worse, it's your professional reputation. And as we know from a business school perspective, people don't buy products, they buy brands. And investors don't invest in companies specifically, they invest in people. And so it's really important that your personal brand is coming through in the most positive light possible, which we're going to be covering today from a variety of perspectives. Now, providing just a little bit more of a historical context, I was interested when I was preparing for this to find out where personal branding actually comes from. How is it that this is something that people, are actually quite concerned about? And then you'll be surprised and hopefully reassured to know that this actually started long before social media. So long before anyone was on LinkedIn or on Facebook, personal branding was actually quite well and alive in most parts of the world. So in the 1970s, there were layoffs at large corporations in the US. And suddenly individuals realized that they couldn't depend on these sort of guarantors of lifelong employment and personal economic stability. And so they thought and realized if they left a company, who was really going to be advocating for them and what did their brand actually stand for? So it was the first major change in society that led to the growth of personal branding. The second one is that society really realized that work could be a source of personal satisfaction and meaning. So people should like what they do, they should gain value from it, they should be happy going to work, and they realized that personal branding often went hand in hand with that. And then finally, of course, technology, this exogenous shock of the internet in our lives really changed the ability to communicate in a variety of ways. And as a result, we now have loads of online tools to share any type of personal thoughts, which often can help or hinder, if done the wrong way, your personal brand. Now, why is personal branding so important? So these are just some quick sort of headlines that I pulled from sort of recent articles in the press. And as you can see here, Forbes actually argued that personal branding is more important than ever for the C-suite. And many of you who likely already have a LinkedIn profile, who might have seen an advertisement for this session on LinkedIn, if you have a LinkedIn profile, you have a personal brand. But it doesn't end there, nor should it end there. It actually can be quite a detriment just having a LinkedIn profile and having no other presence specifically. One thing to keep in mind when growing this personal brand is if you don't define your brand, someone else will. And wouldn't it be amazing if you could be the voice of your own brand? Because it could obviously be to your detriment if someone else is defining you in ways that you don't think align with who you are personally. So as a result, you want to make sure that you're choosing your own messaging, your own values, your own definition, because again, if you don't, your competitors will. No, I'm not saying by the end of this session you will suddenly become Oprah Winfrey in terms of her, legacy personal brand, for example. But your personal brand is really what differentiates you from others. That's one of the main benefits of having one. It also builds credibility. Everyone online and within this space is an expert in a given topic, regardless of what that is. And as a result, your personal brand can and should help you build credibility. So as a leader, your credibility around subject matter, clear communication, and visible confidence will equal success and add to your specific personal brand. It also helps strengthen your network. Everyone hates the concept of networking, of course, but if you have a large pool of dedicated fans invested in your success, then of course that will carry a lot further than otherwise would. It also gives you better job stability and client retention. So research has shown that companies with socially engaged employees were actually 58% more likely to attract talent. So it's actually a great way of, securing greater talent as well. And finally, it boosts sales. So research has shown that 82% of buyers are more willing to place trust in a company when the C-suite is active on social media. Now, I'm not saying everyone has to go out and join TikTok or Instagram for obvious reasons, but I think having some visibility and being on social media in some capacity will actually provide a greater insight into your personal brand. People want authentic experiences. They want transparency from companies. And so having greater visibility on social media from the C-suite is something that will add to that. Now, companies need to invest in personal branding initiatives. This is something I've found with my own work and talking with a variety of industry leaders. Companies are actually putting this as almost a line item specifically for their workers. So employees at companies that invest in personal branding initiatives are 27% more likely to feel optimistic about their company's future, which obviously is great, specifically in this market. 20% are more likely to actually stay at their company. 40% are more likely to believe their company is more competitive because there's this very direct investment in sort of the personal brand of their employees. Many CEOs actually now have personal branding or thought leadership as a line on his or her budget. Okay, so clearly not only is research showing that this is important, but companies are getting behind it as well to really help lead the way for personal branding. So for example, sales teams often select key sales leaders and invest in their personal brands because of the trust that those brands can foster between both the sales leader and potential clients. It's definitely worth putting in extra time and or money into this exact initiative. 75% of HR departments are in fact required to search job applicants online. So next time you're looking for a job or if you're being headhunted, wouldn't it be a lot easier and better if anything they found on the internet was related specifically to something that you put out there and not your competitor, for example? So in order to understand sort of how it is that we build our personal brand, I wanted to now leave sort of the stats and the reasons why this is important and focus a little bit on some theory. So as a sociologist, working obviously in the marketing department at a business school, I really want to fundamentally understand influence and persuasion. And so what I'm going to talk you through here is really how persuasive brand development can actually lead to a stronger personal brand. And really this comes down to the sociology of influence. So sociology, for those of you not familiar with this discipline, is the study of social behavior in human groups, essentially. So what we do as sociologists is we study the influence of social relationships. We determine how those relationships then influence behavior, and we understand how influence develops and changes. So if you think at it from either a consumer brand perspective or any type of investor relations, this is unbelievably crucial in terms of personal branding. Now, how is it that we actually position this notion of influence? Well, as many people on this call can probably relate and understand, individuals' preferences and decisions are heavily influenced by opinions and actions of others. Whether we want to admit it or not, we've all been influenced in some capacity by someone or something. And while social influence effects are large and exist in a wide variety of environments, some people actually have a much larger impact of influencing people than others. And there's actually 4 very distinct characteristics that has been identified both in my research and in others on how it is that this influence actually plays out in the real world. These individuals are often referred to as influencers, and I'm not just talking about YouTube and TikTok stars, but also opinion leaders, and they can trigger adoption of a particular belief or practice in a large population very, very quickly. Now, here are the 4 personal elements that have been identified as exerting greater influence over others. So certain personal sources of information exert more influence than others. This includes, for example, source expertise. So more specifically, if you're an expert in a given space, people are more likely and more willing to be receptive to any type of communication or messaging that you deliver because they perceive you to be an expert. The second one is tie strength. So what is your relationship with this individual? Your actual strength within a network to someone else within that space will lead you to be a little bit more influential in that space than someone else, for example. Demographic similarity, we all like people who are like us, for better or for worse. And so that is, again, another personal element that helps exert influence. And then finally, perceptual affinity. So am I ideologically aligned with someone? As a result, I will be a lot more likely to believe what they say or be influenced by them because of this ideological alignment or perceptual affinity. Now that we've sort of understood very, very briefly, because this is sort of a taster, very quick session on personal branding. One element that a lot of people overlook, I would say, or often minimize in personal branding is the role played by one's gender. And now we do know that gender differences exist, right? This is something that I think will be with us for probably forever. But it's really important to consider how it is that who you are and how you speak to someone based on whether you're a man or a woman will change their perception of your personal brand, for example. So let's just walk through a few examples here. So here's a great infographic that's really illustrating how men and women think differently about career development, for example. So as you can see with men, 34% of them think about their career development, whereas women, 41% think about it a good amount. Hardly ever, we have 0% for women and 1% for men. So I'm not going to focus too much on this graph here. It's really sort of to set the stage or contextualize where we're going next in this gender conversation as part of a key metric, if you will, or concept for your personal brand. Another fascinating study that's been done is looking at how men and women write resumes, which is interesting. And you might think, well, this seems really irrelevant. Why does it matter how someone writes a resume as long as what they need is on the paper? That's true. But what research has shown is because men and women approach situations very, very differently, given we all have our own different reference points, we will judge information presented to us in a way that resonates with our own reference point. So for example, as you can see here, 91% of men describe previous jobs with a bulleted list, okay? Whereas only 36% of women will use a bulleted list. So if I'm a male individual in HR, for example, reviewing a female's resume, I might say, oh, she probably hasn't done much work in this area because I don't see, all these listed bullet points, right? She's obviously very verbose writing in a paragraph form. Okay, or vice versa, 36% of women include non-standard resume sections like personal attributes, whereas men don't. So maybe if I'm a female recruiter looking at a male resume and I think, well, I don't know anything about who this person is. What do they do in their spare time? What are their personal attributes? That's my own reference point based on how I would write the resume, not me specifically, but as the research shows. And so again, we have to sort of adapt thinking who our audience is going to be and how that changes how we will be perceived within a given space. Research has also shown that the more professionally successful a woman becomes, the less likable she is. So that's great news. This is obviously shown in a variety of ways, more specifically, obviously, with Hillary Clinton and Elizabeth Warren. As Politico noted, how does Elizabeth Warren avoid a Clinton redux, written off as too unlikable before her campaign gets off the ground? Okay. And again, this is just a perfect example of how men and women approach certain contexts in different ways based on our own reference points or our own experiences. Now, one thing that we need to understand if we're going to look at gender is that this isn't just sort of black and white, right? There's so many other disciplines within this space that are looking at how even the human brain is shown to be quite different based on the gender differences that appear in neuroscience, for example. So an example that we see here is we're looking at what's referred to as the social brain hypothesis. And this is the reason that primates have such large brains because of the need to process very large amounts of social information, right? We are social beings. This is primal. We want to talk to people. We want to interact with them. And so what this study showed in 2020, that there are in fact major gender differences in the human social brain, whether you're a man or a woman. So what they did as part of this study is they collected background data and conducted MRI scans of over 10,000 men and women, okay, of their brains. And they then compared these brain scans with background data. So the researchers were able to actually determine socio-demographic and lifestyle factors that were common to either men or women. So the study reported that clear gender-specific differences in areas that could be linked to social activities like bonding or engaging in intense contact were actually fundamentally different in the makeup of the brain. So what was key, one of the key findings from the study, it was that human survival has been optimized towards sex-specific strategies to successfully navigate the social world. So if we look at that from a sort of corporate perspective or, from, a professional perspective, we are all navigating our own social world at work and at home based exclusively on how our brain has been set up to deal with social information. And so again, men and women are doing this very, very differently. And that is also playing in a very significant role into how our personal brand is taking shape. So here we have, again, cognitive neuroscience, 10,000 social brains, the sex differentiation in brain anatomy. So we know that being part of social networks provides key advantages, right? There are members clubs, there's social networking online, there's coffee groups, there's mom groups, there's running groups, you name it. People love being in a network. What they've noticed actually in this study was that the neocortex volume in primates, in fact, co-evolved with the cognitive skills required for coping with the complex social dynamics of increasingly large groups. Okay, so let's find out what that actually means. So they realized that daily social interaction with family, friends, and colleagues, may influence brain circuitry differently if you're a man or a woman. This, as a result, provides very significant implications at the evolutionary, developmental, bioregulatory, and sociological scales. So differences in social behavior might actually correspond to brain architecture. right? It might not be how we raise our children, for example, that changes social behavior. It might actually be the makeup of our brain. So some of the findings that they discovered, newborn boys, for example, preferred viewing physical mechanical objects, whereas newborn girls preferred viewing human faces. Young girls have been shown to make more eye contact with their caregivers than boys. During development, girls have been shown to detect sort of social faux pas a lot earlier than boys. Social network size, okay, this is offline, not online, tended to decrease for men and increase for women across their lifespan. In early adulthood, men were reported to have a richer social circle than women, and this often sort of peaked at about 25 years of age. Starting at 39, the effect actually reverses, and the social network size decreases faster in men than in women. Women also tend to contact members of their social network more often, with more insistence, and have longer conversations. The reason I'm really trying to illustrate this for you is because, again, not only is it how we present ourselves at work, but the sort of brain architecture that we were given, right, at birth, for example, is really something that is also fundamentally shaping how we can communicate about who we are as our personal brand. Women, again, feel like imposters in disciplines that value brilliance. This is according to a latest study. Academics who believe, quote unquote, brilliance is a prerequisite for success in their field are actually more likely to doubt their abilities. And while this article in Science came out in August 2021 and the focus was more on academics, that could really be for any discipline specifically or industry. This disproportionately affects women, particularly those of underrepresented racial and ethnic groups. And the study that was conducted here is they were looking at 5,000 STEM and humanities graduate students across 9 universities in the US. And they wanted to see what is really happening here. Why is it that these women in many disciplines feel imposters in spaces that value quote unquote brilliance? And they found, in fact, that one of these main results or answers is actually deeply rooted in popular culture. So I'm just going to read this quote here because I think it sums it up so brilliantly. It says, "It's much harder to come up with examples in popular culture of women, particularly women of color, who, like a Sherlock Holmes or a Dr. House, have that kind of special raw brilliance. Even when accomplished women, like Hermione Granger of Harry Potter, are shown, their intellect is often grounded in hard work, dedication, long hours in the library, as opposed to some sort of wild, innate, untaught intellect." And I think this is fundamentally flawed, right? If women feel that they can only be perceived as brilliant because they put in a lot of a lot of work, they're not suddenly born with it. That's going to, again, change how they present themselves as who they are from a personal branding perspective. Now let's look very quickly at the role of gender stereotypes on your personal brand, because again, we're coming up with these stereotypes, these heuristics of members of the opposite sex based on our own reference points. And we're judging them based on their perceived ability from our own reference. So previous research tells us that gender stereotypes have powerful effects on cognition behavior, reflecting as well as influencing the gap between men and women in many achievement-related spheres. These effects are especially salient in startups, for example, in entrepreneurship, which shows that this is heavily associated often with stereotypically masculine traits. Now, HBR, of course, has talked about the importance of having a sponsor, if you will, which is a great way of cultivating your personal brand. And they found that one of the best ways to attract a sponsor and professional with sponsors is helpful in terms of promotion. 23% more likely than their peers to be promoted are individuals who have someone at work who will go up to bat for them, for example, or who really is advocating for them. Personal branding has some unique challenges for female professionals, which is explaining sort of the context of the previous slides. Research has repeatedly shown that women are subject to this phenomenon referred to as the likability conundrum, where again, people don't like women who seem to be high achieving or very good at their jobs. Gender norms presume that women should be agreeable, warm, nurturing, and then when these norms are violated in some capacity, so maybe when they step up to make a tough decision, they have a strong opinion, they want to promote themselves, for example, they're often penalized for that behavior in ways that men wouldn't be necessarily, again, because of those reference points that people have about members of the opposite sex. Now, there's a woman I worked with at Georgetown when I was there who's a linguist, and her work looks at gendered communication. She's a very prolific woman, Professor Deborah Tannen. And she wrote this great piece in Harvard Business Review called Who Gets Heard and Why. I would highly recommend reading it. We don't have time to go through that paper today, although I do it in some of my classes. And so one of the key questions that she asks is, what does confidence, competence, and authority sound like? And if I asked everyone on this call, everyone would have a very different answer, and it would probably be rooted in whether you are a man or a woman. And so what Tannen has been saying for years now is that judgments about confidence can be inferred only from the way that people present themselves. And much of that is actually how we speak. So our personal brand isn't just what someone reads about on a piece of paper, it's how we present ourselves in person, online, but actually also the way we speak. So for example, this actually starts in childhood, as she's identified in her research, where boys tend to learn rituals that focus on status dimensions, whereas girls tend to learn conversational rituals that focus on a rapport dimension of relationships. So an example of status dimension, for example, would be if a little kid said, oh, I can throw a ball this high, and shows his hand. And the other said, no, I can throw it this high, and, raises it a little bit more. And then the third kid says, no, I can throw it this high. And they all start laughing. So these boys aren't necessarily competing with each other. They're actually bonding over the status dimension because they're similar to each other, but just having that one-up relationship. Whereas girls, and often women, tend to focus more on conversational rituals that focus on a rapport dimension. So for example, if someone says, oh, I had a terrible sleep last night, and then someone says, oh, I did too, it was the worst. And then someone says, oh, me too, I didn't get to bed till 5. It doesn't matter if any of that is true or relevant. It's the fact that they're connecting with one another over this shared experience or this level of similarity. And so it's important to consider then when we're talking to someone of the opposite sex about anything in the professional environment that we're approaching this level of bonding, if you will, or presentation skills based on our own reference point, whether we're using a status dimension or a rapport dimension. So here's the article I spoke about, The Power of Talk, Who Gets Heard and Why. And some of the key findings from her article argue that individual speakers vary in how sensitive they are to the social dynamics of language. And that's often how people say things to them, right? It's those subtle nuances of what others say to them that help them navigate the social dynamics of a given workplace, for example. Men tend to be sensitive to the power dynamics of interaction, speaking in ways that often position themselves as a one-up and resisting being put in a one-down position by others, right? So, like the age-old joke that men don't stop and ask for directions, because that would have been, a status dynamic, if you will. Women tend to react more strongly to this rapport dynamic, as I mentioned, speaking in ways that save face for others, buffering statements that could be seen as putting others in a one-down position. Women do this often by saying things in emails such as just checking in as opposed to checking in, for example. So just adding sort of buffer words, if you will, to help sort of cushion a given statement. These linguistic patterns are very pervasive, and I'm sure everyone on this call has heard hundreds of these exchanges pretty much daily. Now, in order to understand your linguistic style, we have to remember that this is a set of culturally learned signals by which we not only communicate what we mean, but, and this is the key bit here, we interpret others' meanings and evaluate one another as people based on these culturally learned signals. Okay, so again, these reference points that we have, whether they are innate or learned, are really how we judge other individuals. As we said here, judgments, again, are mainly in the form of talk. So we often think about what to say, right? Before anyone does any big presentation at work or has a meeting with someone, we probably recite in our head what we're going to say, but we actually don't focus on how we're going to say it. And again, how we say something based on whether we're a man or a woman is very, very different and actually adds or can detract, depending on how it's done, to your personal brand. So one thing to also keep in mind here is that language, in fact, negotiates relationships. So what's natural for most men speaking in a given language is maybe not natural for women, for example. So you're going to be heard very, very differently based on who your audience is. So the status and rapport example, as I said earlier, others examples are men often say I, where women say we. So a man might say, I had a great quarter, or a woman might say, we had a great quarter. Whether there was a team involved or not, again, it's how people get acknowledged for work is, again, another form of talk. Women are likely to downplay their certainty, according to research, whereas men are likely to minimize their doubts. So we're just going to close very briefly here with talking very quickly, if you will, about the power of networking. No one likes the concept of networking. It's sort of like nails on a chalkboard. But again, it's something that's so crucial, even more so now with people returning to the office at a more accelerated rate than in previous years. So a recent HBR article talked about overcoming aversions to networking and how if you actually overcome this aversion, you might, I'm not going to say enjoy networking, but might actually see the professional benefit of it, okay? Professional networks lead, as many of us know, to more job and business opportunities, broader and deeper knowledge, greater capacity to innovate, and obviously greater status and authority within a given network. So 4 quick strategies to help you overcome an aversion to networking. Focus on learning. So if you suddenly shift or pivot your focus from prevention to promotion, you're now networking as an opportunity for discovery and learning rather than saying, oh, this is something that I have to do for work. Okay, so that sort of pivot of your motivation will bring networking maybe a little bit lighter as a chore. Identify common interests. So think about how your interests and your goals align with the people that you meet, and maybe look at how you can form sort of more meaningful or greater connection with individuals from an interest and goal perspective. Another way of doing it is think broadly about what you can give, right? Don't look at networking as what can I get from other people, but what value can you actually offer individuals? This might seem less self-promotional, more selfless, and therefore maybe hopefully worth, maybe a little bit more worthy of your time. And then finally, find a higher purpose, not in sort of a religious sense, but maybe more in a corporate sense. So in this article, they found that attorneys, for example, who focused on the collective benefit of making connections, so they say this is important for my firm or this will help my clients, rather than any type of personal motivation, like I need to support my career, these individuals found that networking was more authentic, they were more likely to network, and actually the results show that they had more billable hours. So again, just changing and pivoting networking from a chore to something that can sort of help maybe the company or your clients is a great way of going about it. Now, 2 very easy ways of networking is networking both inside and outside of your organization. You think, well, you know, that makes sense. Obviously, I'm not going to stay networking in an organization, but let's really figure out why that's relevant and how you can do it. So when you only select, when only a select group of individuals knows about you and your work, what happens if that individual is made redundant, gets sick, isn't at a meeting for promotion? No one really is there to speak to you, and therefore your personal brand is in jeopardy. So if your department is reorganized, your company has layoffs, as I said, no one is really going to be in a position to help you. So you have to cultivate a very broad network. So if your situation changes or if you need backup, there are other people who are willing to talk about you and for you. So maybe make a point of building professional connections with people external to your work, right? Maybe through parents at your kid's school, any type of relationship of proximity, like a neighbor, hobbies, or friends of friends, okay? Very important to sort of broaden that network as best you can. And this is often done by investing in bonding and bridging capital. So most individuals overinvest in bonding capital and they underinvest in bridging capital. So what does that mean? So bonding capital exists between people like us, quote unquote, or people who are in it together. So these are often individuals like your family members, your neighbors, close friends, probably people at work who you have lunch with every day. Whereas bridging capital is a type of capital that many people forget about, to be honest, and it describes connections that link people across a cleavage that typically divides society. So race, class, or religion, for example. It's association that bridges between communities, groups, and organizations. So in other words, we often, to a fault, I would say, have too many connections to individuals who are like us, working in the same company or the same industry, and not nearly enough of people who are dissimilar to us. And that has to change. We really do need to make sure that we're investing equally in both bonding and bridging capital. Okay, so how does this all come together? Well, we're going to apply a very strategic approach to your personal brand. And it's all about creating a persona and marketing yourself as an expert in your industry in ways that people should trust you and your opinions. And there are 3 strategies that can help your talents do this. 1, network both inside and outside of your organization, as we've discussed. Make sure that you're controlling your narrative. You're the one who's actually putting information out there about yourself, not your competitors. And maybe try to share your ideas publicly, obviously in a very safe space, for example, but consider maybe, contributing to a newsletter, a blog, or even just sending an email out to people you haven't spoken to in a while. So some key takeaways for becoming your own publicist, of course, being your own sort of personal branding advocate, if you will. You want to make sure that you're developing an online persona, right? Everyone's first thing they do is they Google you. That's not going to change. So every social media profile that you own is promoting you. So what are your profiles saying? Are you representing the brand that is you professionally? If you're putting anything out there, people are checking it and they're judging you. So make sure that anything that is on the internet about you specifically is something that you can monitor, curate, or really deal with professionally. So developing a personal brand on social media is important because it can help you grow if you switch jobs, start a new business, and any type of milestone that you get obviously falls under this specific personal brand. So you want to think of yourself as a brand. That's sort of the first thing to do after this call. The authenticity within this space is key. Perhaps set up an online audit of yourself. You can set up Google Alerts for free on Google. So anytime your name appears anywhere on the internet, you genuinely get an email saying, is this you? This is an email about something that's been said about you online. So make sure that you're auditing your online presence. Secure a personal website. It doesn't mean that you have to necessarily publish on that site, but if you maybe have a highly visible role, for example, it might be worth owning that domain name so no one else comes if it's a name that's quite common. And then find ways to produce value. So you want to find ways to add value to your audience by creating and curating content that's in line with your personal brand. So that doesn't mean that your content always has to be focused on anything professional, but maybe if you start running or do yoga or bake or anything like that, that would be another great outlet for you. And then be purposeful in what you share. This is often overlooked. Every tweet you send, every status update contributes to your personal brand. So make sure that there's a reason why you're posting, right? If you don't have a reason, don't do it, but make sure anything you do is purposeful. And then try to associate with other strong brands, okay? So the 3 C's, company, college, and colleagues. Is there something that you can do within that space to help connect with those individuals and help them promote who you are? And as I've been saying, a very strong personal brand is dependent on a strong narrative, and that narrative starts with something that you decide to put out there and create on behalf of who you think you stand for. So every pitch, meeting, and interview takes place in a context. This often is involving gender, for example, so make sure that that's being taken into account. And that context is so crucial, specifically with first impressions. Therefore, if you want to succeed with your personal brand, you have to understand context as much as possible. And that's gender biases, company culture, country culture, and of course, personalities. So control your brand. This takes work, right? This isn't going to happen overnight, but make sure that whatever you're doing to grow or accelerate your personal brand, you're doing in a way that's both authentic and also polished. Okay, thank you. I'm going to stop my sharing, come back, and we have Lucky with us.
Thanks, Gillian. That was really, really interesting, and there were so many nuggets and food for thought in that short session. So thank you so much, and I'm sure everybody's got a lot to think about and kind of put into practice after your presentation. So yeah, as Gillian said, we are taking questions. So any questions you have, you can pop them in through the Q&A function, or you can raise your hand. We can unmute you, and you can share your thoughts, perhaps with Gillian on her session, or any questions you have. Please share them now. Gillian, maybe while everyone's kind of thinking about it, are there any really interesting or key examples of people with kind of really strong personal brands that you would kind of put out there as kind of great examples?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a lot of them have to be, they're in the public eye, so they have to be quite visible. But there's a woman out of the US, her name's Nell Diamond, and she runs a company called Hill House Home. And I've been chronicling and watching her for years now, and she just has this great balance of showing parts of her personal life that aren't too intrusive, as well as growing the business and communicating with her clients in a way that sort of makes everything quite transparent. So I think she has an MBA from Yale. She went to Princeton. She's just nailed it, I think, in terms of her personal branding in a way that isn't over the top, isn't too much information, but actually just works so brilliantly.
Amazing. Great. We'll definitely check her out. We have a question from Jaya, who says that the session was very interesting. Thank you. Any tips for presenting a strong, positive brand in meetings?
No, that's a perfect question. I mean, even myself, when I'm in a meeting, my first sort of point of reference is who is the audience, right? So I tend to adapt my communication style based on who's in the room. And I think that's a great way of just ensuring that anything you say, which is obviously a direct connection with your personal brand, is being received in a way that highlights the best bit of what you want to say, essentially. So ensuring that everyone in that room is going to be the most receptive to your message, because you're taking into account maybe gender, culture, country, company cultures, and just ensuring that people are listening in a way that they're going to receive the message in the way that you intend it to be received.
Great. Thank you so much. I think we have a couple of questions coming through. So Kate Woods has popped a question in. She said, it's a very interesting presentation. Interesting to understand how to keep the personal and professional separate yet aligned. Yeah, and I was thinking that as well, actually thinking about social media, your personal social media versus kind of a LinkedIn account.
Exactly. And that comes back to audience. I mean, I think I have, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, and everything I post is very different based on the audience. So I know with Facebook, for example, the largest growing demographic on that platform is women over 50. And so suddenly I have lots of colleagues who want to be friends with me on Facebook. And so I've had to recently go through and sort of curate and change how I position myself and communicate in that space, because the audience has changed. So it's just being very, very aware of the expectations of given platforms. And those expectations might not be your expectations, but they're the expectations of the people who are judging you or evaluating you, which again would be the audience.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I see it says quite time consuming. It's up to you in terms of how much time you want to spend on it. Some people do, some people don't. Again, I think considering your motivation for why you're on the platform is probably the first checkpoint.
Thanks, Gillian. So we've got another question from Imran, and he says, it's been a great session. Quick question: if you have different audiences, such as corporate world versus the entrepreneurial world, and academics, but you want sort of separation, is this possible?
A separation in the audience, or a separation in who you're talking to?
I think he's talking.
From personal branding. In terms of you wear different hats. I guess I'm thinking that's probably. So I'm in corporate. Okay, sorry. Yes, yeah. Okay, absolutely. No, I mean that's a fair point, right? So I'm an academic. I also do consulting on the side. I coach my daughter's football team. I'm a mom, so I mean loads of different hats. And that's great. I think it actually one adds to the other. For example, so if you're an academic, an entrepreneur, you work in corporate, just think about where your audience is that you want to talk to, what platform or space are they in, and then adapt accordingly. So you do need to be a little bit more strategic, but then when you do interact with these individuals or these very distinct audiences, you're doing it in a way that, again, they would be quite receptive to whatever you're saying. So it takes a little bit more strategy, but just find out where they are and then communicate on their turf, basically.
Thanks, Gillian. So we have a question from Riley on how do you suggest coming off as a professional woman while not coming off as bossy or unlikable? The age-old question.
Yeah, that is sort of the million-pound question. I think, to be honest, if someone is going to assume or judge you for being bossy or unlikable, let them, right? I think it's their loss if they think that, because obviously it's not true. I think just continuing to work hard, stay focused on what you need to do, and deliver what you need to do. That's fine. Let the judgments come as long as it's not affecting you personally. Men are often not told they're bossy, they're told they're confident. And that's what that Deborah Tannen article talks about. So maybe just consider your audience when you're talking if you need to adapt accordingly. But if someone says, oh, she's mean or bossy, just let them think that. I think there's no harm in that. It's not worth it.
Yep, here. So we've had a question from Satya, which is, and she says, hi, Gillian, thank you. Some interesting academic and practical insights. Do you have any tips for how to decipher some of the non-visible cultural influences which may affect how you position your personal brand, for example, in a meeting?
That's a great question. And that's one thing that unfortunately we didn't have time to cover because cultural differences are so crucial, obviously. And I don't mean to repeat myself, but go back to the audience. So find out what is the predominant culture, let's say in a meeting of individuals you're talking to, and what are they used to, or not even used to, more receptive in terms of listening. And then I'm not saying by any means everyone has to change themselves to be heard, but I think strategic pivots or adaptations often help be perceived or heard in specific ways. So go back. I mean, and that's sort of marketing 101, right? Like, what does your audience want? Cater to your audience, cater to your audience. And I think as soon as people take that on, when we're the product, we're the brand, it helps individuals present themselves in a way that they have more control and their messaging is received better by the people in that space.
Thanks, Gillian. So looks like we still have a couple of minutes for a couple more questions. But I had one. So you mentioned, the kind of backbone of a strong personal brand is a strong narrative. Any advice on how to kind of come to, your narrative, the best narrative, put that, basically kind of bring it to fruition?
No, it's a great question. I mean, I think the first sort of point should be on LinkedIn. I don't love LinkedIn, but it's part of the game, so everyone has to sort of play it. But that space about, that about me space, that's actually a perfect landscape for you to curate and write a very strategic sort of narrative about who you are, including, maybe a bit about your background, things you do, not necessarily personal attributes, but things you like to do, maybe a little bit on the side as well. And then just being consistent. So people know when they hear your name, oh, this person does X, Y, and Z, and they stand for these things. I think that's very, very important. Having a narrative is making sure that you're consistent in sharing that information. So there isn't any space for people to question or doubt, something you might have said before.
Great. Okay. And just on that, Gillian, so if you're now, I don't know, you have a different hobby, or if you're making a career transition and you're entering a new space, how would you navigate your personal brand, and how would you kind of adjust your personal brand or your narrative to support that?
So I'd start with research. So I'd find someone in that space who you admire or who you think is doing really, really well, and see what they're doing. So whether, you're going to events and you're seeing them there, or you think they have a great website, or they just do things that you're not used to, emulate that, right? If they're doing something, I think that's sort of the best way. I'm not saying copycat, but find someone somewhere that you think is doing what you would like to do, and sort of see how they're doing it. Because obviously, if it's successful, then it's a viable opportunity within that space. So just keep an eye on doing a little bit of research on it. And again, know that it won't happen overnight, right? So none of these things happen immediately, but it's just being really well versed on sort of the currency in the space, really.
That's really great advice. Thank you, Gillian.
Cool.
We still have time for some questions, but perhaps while you're thinking, I can just take you through a bit of information about our upcoming Executive MBA program. Let me just quickly share the slides with you. Can you see that?
Yeah, we can.
Perfect. doing something a bit strange. Okay, sorry about that. Here is the slide. So just wanted to give you some information about Executive MBA program, which is starting this September, at the end of September. We're really excited about it. Gillian is teaching on the course, and she leads the impact project that will be in the second year. And we have some really fantastic faculty and speakers as part of that program. So it's a 21-month program that takes place across block weeks every 2 months. It's part-time for working professionals with around 10 years of work experience, but we are looking for people who have, great leadership skills, leadership expertise, managed large projects, and have had kind of personal success and professional success, and are now thinking about sort of what next and how to kind of frame their career and their personal development in the next couple of years. We have scholarships available, so you can see the cost of the program, but we do have support available for our students. And in terms of kind of who we're looking for, so we're looking for people who are thinking about sort of, their next steps and kind of promotion, their career sort of promotion acceleration, but also thinking about how to marry purpose and profit together. So the theme of the program is better business for a better world. So there's a big ESG focus within the course that looks at kind of thinking about the regulation around ESG, but actually moving away from complying with that to now kind of thinking about how organizations can and executives can move away from that and actually think about value creation around sustainable business and responsible business as well. So do have a look at our program. Happy to have a conversation with you to tell you more. As well, you can drop me an email and we can follow up after this session to have a one-to-one. We also have some exciting events coming up in the next couple of weeks. One of them is led by Kate Woods, who's on this call, and it will be around how to use design thinking to start planning in terms of kind of your professional development and kind of thinking about your next steps. And Kate Woods is now going to be leading the kind of careers offering that executive MBA students will receive on the program. So good opportunity to meet her, meet some of the faculty members and some of the members of the cohort that potentially you'd be on the program with. So do come along to that. And I'm just writing my email address here. So do get in touch with us if you have any questions. Gillian, any final thoughts before we wrap up? I don't think we've, we have a question from Ellen. So Ellen says, thank you very much for the presentation. How can we balance between personality, so personal comfort zone, and personal branding, which was presented by today's topic? Oh, sorry, Gillian, you're on mute.
Thank you. It's a good question. I think it depends on your industry, to be honest. So some industries, they really want you to sort of show your personality. For example, if you work, in media or entertainment or the arts, for example, whereas maybe if you're in a more corporate role as an attorney, for example, they don't necessarily want that much personality to come out. But I think there's sort of some safe ways you can do that. I think how do you present yourself? Jewelry, getting dressed, that seems so trivial, but that's actually an incredible way of showing your personality in a way that maybe might not be too risky in some capacity. I think even talking about hobbies that you do, that's another way of showing your personality. But again, what is your audience going to think about that? Okay, that's something that we really have to keep in mind here. And I know you're sort of taught from a young age, don't worry what people think about you. That's true. But in a professional environment, that's your personal brand, right? It's what people say when you step out of the room. So just keep that in mind with your personality, is maybe do some baby steps. Thinking, without pushing the boundaries too much.
Great, thanks, Gillian. So I think that's all the questions. So thank you so much. It's been a really, really interesting, insightful session. I've learned so much, and I'm sure everybody else has. Yes, any questions from the audience about the session, please get in touch and we can answer those. But yeah, really lovely to spend this time with you all and enjoy the rest of your weekend. Enjoy your weekend.
Thanks so much, Lucky. Thanks for meeting,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.